What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the fighting game tutorial series, we're going to be going over our in-game shop or store, part 3. Specifically, we're going to be going over being able to move between our entries in the store and have their name and description come up on the bottom here. So you can see I'm on my characters category. I can move left and right, and my text down here by my mouse will say the name that we have in the data table for this item and the description we have in the data table for this item. As I move, it changes to update with the selection that we're currently on. I can also change my category, and it still works for every item in that category as well. So that's what we're going to be covering today. This is really exciting because now that we are going to be able to go and select our individual items, we will then finally be able to actually buy these items, which is the whole point of the shop or the store. That way we can unlock them for use in the game. So like I said, that's what we're covering today. But before we hop into that, if you want to get caught up in the series, feel free to click this icon in the top right corner right here. I'll link you to the entire playlist so you can see every episode we've done. I believe this is episode 172. Alternatively, feel free to click this episode right here if you're only interested in the in-game shop and store. That is the first episode of this little mini-series within the fighting game, so if you want to check it out, you can get caught up and follow this tutorial more easily. But with that said, guys, we can go ahead and get started. And we don't need to do anything in the code today. It is, again, all within the widgets. So we will stick to blueprints, and we're going to go to our store widget to start. So let's open up our store widget, and let's open up our store item icon widget. The item icons are the individual ones that we spawn, create, and put in the vertical and horizontal boxes, so we can place them based on how many elements there are. For example, the mannequin is one store item icon, the mutant is another store item icon, and each stage is also one as well. In the store item icon widget, we had the icon button, which was just the image that we were changing out. So by default, it is just this gray standard button image, but when we actually load the data in from the data table, we set the button image to be the icon that we attached in the data table. And just a quick refresher on that, we go into our unlockable item data table. This is where all that data is set. So there you go. I've added a border today. It's really hard to tell here unless you zoom in, but you can see there's a black border that is surrounding this icon image. This is so we can actually change the style of the border to give it this effect that you see here with the blue outline in the 1 saying that player 1 is hovering over this item. We're going to change the appearance of the border to actually look a certain way when we're hovering over it. That way we know which one the player is selecting. We can go ahead and do this very easily by adding an image to the canvas panel or whatever your parent container is that your icon button was in. So here are the details for my icon button. You may have already seen this because I have covered it in the other in-game store episodes, but you can take a look at those if you want the specific size and everything that I have. Now, dragging that image in to the scene or into the canvas panel, like I said, you'll get, of course, your standard image here. What we want to do is make sure that the details of this image line up with the details of the icon button. So if the icon button has a size of 240 and 240, for the X and the Y, we want the image to also be 240 and 240. This will make sure that it is the same size as the button, which is good because when we get a border, we want it to just be the outline. So it should be the same size, just a different image. It's not going to be the same image as the icon itself. It's just going to be a border image that we have. So going to the one I've already done, the icon border, you can see I've set the position to be the same as the icon button, and I've set the size to be the same as well. Now the difference here is that the icon button has the brush as a default value, and it is set in the blueprint logic. What I've done for appearance here, just to make it look a little bit better on the actual widget itself, is I have a standard border image. This is one I created for the character select screen. And it is just a square that has a transparent center. That's what these tiles are, these white and gray tiles. It means that it's transparent so we can see through it, which is what we want because we just want this outline. So going back to the store item icon, I'm using that as the brush image. So if you open up brush, take a look at image, you can put a border image on it if you want. It's not actually required that you do that, but I would recommend that you have some way to test it visually just so that you know it is working. You can take a look at the rest of the details on here, but I haven't changed anything else. And that's literally all you need to do. We're just going to make sure we have this icon border here because we are going to take that icon border and modify it when the player has pressed an input that would make it so we are hovering over top of store item. So basically the player is navigated to the store item and we want to make sure we're displaying that properly to the player. Once you've done that, we can go into the store widget and we will go to the graph. Nothing has changed in terms of the actual design today, so you don't have to worry about that one. We can go into the graph and let's start in the event graph. So this is what we had in the event graph prior. We set up all of our controls from moving left and right, up and down, menu confirm. We also had the back button in here, but we still haven't implemented that yet. We can easily add that. Don't worry, we will be adding it very soon. And then we were calling move selection just so that we could set it on the initial entry in the list and make sure that we started on the first item. After that, we were grabbing all of our unlockable item data and we were checking to see if it was character because that's our first category. And if it was, we were adding the children, so all the store items that belong to the character category, to the horizontal box. The horizontal box is inside of this vertical box. And so it is basically the first row in the vertical box. When we add things to it, of course, we're going to be able to see them on the screen. So that is how we actually start seeing our store item icon widgets in the store widget. Now, there's actually two things that we changed about this little section here. So when we get all the data table rows from our data table, we were calling a function called setItemDetails that was in our store item icon. So if we go into our graph, we had created the setItemDetails and we're passing along an image to set the brush of the icon button. Or in other words, we were changing the icon button here to be the mannequin or the mutant or the stage icon images. However, we also have a name and description on our store widget right here that we set up, but we haven't used yet. We're going to make sure that that works today. We're going to get that working. So in the store item icon, in the setItemDetails function, I just moved these three nodes over a little bit. And then in the setItemDetails function, I added two new strings for the name and the description. So we'll pass in the item name and the item description from the data table to this function. That way, this store item icon can actually hold the name, the description, and the image. To be able to maintain that data outside of this function, we're going to need to make two variables as well. So let's start off by making two variables that get passed into this function. So click on your setItemDetails function, go to the details panel, down to your inputs where we had the icon image that was a texture 2D. And I've added two new parameters. One I've called item name, and one I've called item description. And I've changed them both to be the string variable type. I made them strings because the name and description within the data table are strings because the structure that was used to create them had these variables as strings. But you can make them text if you want since they are going to be used to set text on the widget. It doesn't really matter. It's just going to be a conversion if we use strings. And once we have these inputs here, you'll get these new nodes on the setItemDetails function. If you want to move your parameters up to the top like I did, you can use these arrows to rearrange the order. I put the icon image down at the bottom. I'm also going to change the name from icon image to item image because I think it makes a little bit more sense. Now simply in this function, set item details, we need to make sure that we can actually use the two parameters we just set up, and that's where our variables are going to come in. So we're going to make two variables on our store item icon, and essentially this icon is going to store the details about the item. So it's going to store the name, the description, and the image of the item so far. It'll also probably store the cost of the item when we get into actually purchasing or unlocking these items. But for now, we only worry about the name and the description, so we can add two new variables to the actual widget. And I'm just calling them name and description, and they are also strings by default. Then simply just take the item name from the set item details function and set the name variable that we just created. And then I'm taking the item description parameter in the function and setting the description variable that we just created. So now the name, description, and image will all be set on this widget. Once we're done, we can go back to the store widget, and when we do, we can go back to our graph where we were calling set item details, that thing I was just telling you about earlier. There will now be two new parameters that are empty at the current time, but we want them to be filled out by default when we come into the widget. So before we were breaking the unlockable item, and we were just grabbing the type to see if it was character, and if it was, we were passing along the image to set item details. Now we want to make sure that we're also passing along the name and the description. So you can see we have the name and description in the break unlockable item, and I'm just passing them along to the appropriate parameter in the set item details. It is that simple. Now the store item icon will have all the data we need to display that properly. There's one other thing we need to do in the event graph. And if we go to where we were doing our for each loop for all the data table row names, once this loop is completed, we know that all the data for the character category is set up appropriately. At this point, we want to know how many items are in each category. This is because we need to properly navigate through this store menu. And so for example here, I only have 2 characters. So if I keep pressing my right button, I want to stay on the rightmost character, which is my mutant here. If I press left one time, I should go over to the mannequin. That's working. If I go to my stages, however, I have 4. So I need to be able to move all the way over to the 4th element and move all the way back. To do this, we need to know how many elements we have in each of these categories. And we had something to do this, a variable called max selections in each row, that was defaulting everything to 1 because we only had the category buttons that we could navigate through. But now we're going to be able to actually navigate through the individual items, so these values will have to change to represent how many items are in the store. To do this, I'm going to make a new function that I call determine number of items in each category. So to make a new function, you can just press plus function right here, go into that function. And what I want to do is loop through our data table row names again. I know we were just doing this in the event graph, and so it's a little bit repetitive, but we want to pull different data and we want to do different things with it now. That was just an introductory, set our widget up properly so that the store looks good when the player comes into it, whereas this is actually changing our data and making sure all that data is correct. So I'm going to do the get data table row names again, which is literally get data table row names, and we're going to select the data table that we want. We have the unlockable item data table. Then we're going to do the same thing we did in the event graph, and we're going to loop through each of these row names. Then using the row name, we can get the data for the current data table row by calling get data table row. Again, using the unlockable item data, and then passing in the array element to the row name. This will get out all the data for that row within the data table. So for example, if we find that we are on index 0, then we'll grab the data for the mannequin. If we find we're on index 3, we'll grab the data for stage training area 2. That's why we were able to drag off the out row, break the unlockable item, and then grab all the appropriate data from it so we could call the set item details function that we were doing in the construct event. So that's what we've done here. But this time it is going to be a little bit different. What we're really trying to do here is use the type of the item to determine how many items are going to be in that category. So once we have broken it, we have the type here, and we can drag out and bring that into a switch on E unlockable item type. That's what we have right here. Now, if we find that this row is a character type, then we can assume that we have a character unlockable item. If we keep a total of all of these, we will then figure out how many character selections, stage selections, outfit selections, and setting selections there are in the store. Now, to keep a total, we need a variable. And we don't need to keep track of this variable the whole time. Each individual variable, we only really need to keep track of it whenever this function is called, and then max selections in each row will be updated to those values. So I went ahead and scrolled down to the bottom below variables and below event dispatchers. There's a local variables section here. And I've added 4 local variables. That means these functions will be created within the function and they will be destroyed once the function finishes. It is much better for performance to do it this way. And so I made 4 variables, just added 4 local variables that are all integers. They all start as a default value of 0. And it is the 4 variables that I mentioned to you earlier, the num character selections, num stage selections, num outfit selections, and num setting selections. Essentially, make a local variable for every one of your categories. We know we have 4 categories because the switch statement says so, but also on our widget itself, we have character, stages, outfit, skins, and game settings. You also might just know how many you have just from doing it, so it doesn't really matter. Just make sure that you keep track of all your different categories, and you have a local variable to keep the total on them. Now, we don't have to do anything with none, which is my default switched value. If it's none, a none category, then we don't need to display it here. It's basically invalid or not in use right now, so we can just ignore it. Otherwise, whenever the type from the data table row matches character, we want to increment the num character selections. So we can grab our local variable and just get it, and then we can increment int. So increment integer. Essentially, this will just automatically add 1 to this variable. So this is basically the same as doing num character selections plus 1 and setting num character selections to that result. And we want to do this for all of our variables, all of our local variables that we just set up. And once we do that, we will have the appropriate count of all the items in each category of our store. Now, you won't need the other variables right now, so you can go into your break and remove the name, description, and image as pin if you'd like, just to clean it up a little bit. But that's not required. Just looks a little bit nicer. Once we're done looping through them, so for each loop completed, we have all the values we need. Now we can set each individual array element for max selections in each row based on the index and the final result from the variables that we calculated above. So we can use our max selections in each row, which remember, all the default values were just 1. If we drag off of this, we can do something called set array element, and it's to set the array element. So we can pass in a value for the item at a given index. Max selections in each row has a value for each category, right? We have 4 categories. We have character, stage, outfits, and settings. And so index 0 is for characters. To set this properly then, we want to use our num character selections as the item. Basically, set the characters category to have this many elements. And that's it. We're just going to do that for all of our different cases. So we have max selections in each row at index 0 as our num character selections. The next index is index 1, and index 1 is our stage category. So we want to grab max selections in each row, set the array element at index 1, and pass in num stage selections. Max selections in each row, set array element at index 2 will be for the outfits and skins. So we want to make sure we're using the num outfit selections variable. Lastly, max selections in each row, set array element at index 3, is game settings. So we want to use our num settings selections. And now our max selections in each row will have all the appropriate values so that the game knows exactly how many elements we can navigate through as the player on the store widget. One quick thing, I do want to change the name from max selections in each row to max selections in each category. It could get a little confusing in the next episode if we don't change that, so I would recommend that you do change it. But of course, it's just a name and is not required. There we go. Our max selections in each category is now set up properly. So going back to the event graph, like I said, on the completion of the initial for each loop we have for this data table, we want to go ahead and call our function determine number of items in each category. That's the new function we just made. So call that. And afterward, I would recommend that you call move selection again. This way we can actually trigger the border properly when we get that set up. The initial move selection we called here, after listening for inputs, got us on the appropriate category. We may also want to make sure that we start on the first item. See how when I come into the store, I'm already selecting the mannequin, not just the character category. If you want it to work like that, then we'll want to call move selection again after figuring out how many items are in each category so we know which one to highlight and which one to select for the user. Additionally, I would make sure that is horizontal movement is true in this case because we do want to navigate horizontally. We're already on the proper category, but we want to say that we're moving horizontally onto the individual store items. Now, again, since we are using direction 0, it won't really matter. We're not moving. But by using horizontal movement, we can change some logic within our move selection function to make sure that we highlight the appropriate box and appropriate item in the store widget. So once you've done this, you are good to go with the event graph and the event construct. Now the next thing we need to do is go to our move selection. In move selection, we had a lot of logic to basically determine if we were within the bounds of the items on the screen. So if we moved up and down, we were making sure that we were within the category list. So we did not fall out of the category. We did not go too far. We didn't go up above it. We didn't go too far to the left or right. Everything is actually still good here. We don't have to change any of it. However, after the current selection in row was set for either a horizontal or a vertical movement, they both blended paths at this point, and we were calling determine button to focus, display hovered option, and then we were playing a sound effect. But now the logic is a little bit more diverse. So instead of blending into one set of logic, if we are vertical movement, we're still calling determine button to focus and display hovered option. But if we're horizontal movement, we're now doing a little bit different logic as well. Now, the goal of this store widget is for us to be able to populate this area with store items. And so you may have up and down movements on these items as well. For example, say we can fit 5 characters across the screen, but you want the characters to then loop down over here, and you could fit 5 more in the next row. Assuming you want that, we will not be able to do that by the end of this episode, but I will be going over how to do it in the series. For now, we're going to assume that horizontal movement is just to navigate between the items within the store. Vertical movement is going to be used to navigate through the categories. Now, this isn't always true, and even in the next episode, it won't be true. But for now, we want to assume it is, because if we try and implement that early, it's really going to be confusing without the visual aid. So just remember, this top path here is if is horizontal movement is true, so essentially if we're moving left or right. The bottom path here is if is horizontal movement is false, meaning that we're moving up or down. The up or down logic already works and is not going to be changed today for any reason. However, the horizontal logic is. So we have this determine button to focus function that we set up in the previous episode. And what we were doing was determining if the category we were on needed to change. For example, if we are on the store and we're on the characters category and I press down, well, now the stages category should be highlighted. That's what determine button to focus was doing. It was determining which button we were on. So when I press the down key, we move down to stages. It's pretty simple conceptually. But this specifically was using the category vertical box. The category vertical box is not the same as the item vertical box. So that's where things start to get a little bit weird right now. But don't worry, we're going to get it all fixed up. So what I'd recommend doing is duplicating this function by right-clicking, determine button to focus, and duplicating it, or copying all the logic in it, making a new function that I've called determine item button to focus, and pasting it inside that function. Just to show you, we have determine button to focus, which looks like this, and determine item button to focus, which looks like this. Now the names are a little similar right now, so again, for convenience sake, I want to go ahead and rename determine button to focus. This is the one we already had in the series and the one that we are using for the vertical movement right now. So determine button to focus, I want to rename to determine category button to focus. All right, because this is if we're changing categories, we want to use the category vertical box. So this still makes sense. We still want to do this, but that little name change will help us a little bit because it will tell us exactly what we're doing. We're trying to change categories here. All right. Now, the other one that I was telling you to duplicate or make a new function and copy everything over is determine item button to focus. It's different because this is the individual store items, not the categories. It is not required to separate these functions. If you're curious, you could do it within the one function, but I find it easier to separate them because we may want to do different things when we're moving through categories and different things when we're moving through items. So for maximum customization, I went ahead and made two different ones. Now there's only 3 changes that we really need to make between these functions to make them work for each case. So for determine category button to focus, we were checking the category vertical box, the current row we were in, and we were casting to a button because each of the category options are just regular buttons. But each individual store item is a little bit different. So let's go to determine item button to focus. You'll see we're using the item horizontal box, which right now is just a horizontal box within a vertical box. Right now we only have one, but remember I said we could have multiple in the future. Since we only have one right now, I'm just working with the one that we have. Basically, we're grabbing the horizontal box, we're getting all the children of it, and then we're getting the column that we're in, the current selection in row. Remember, in the determine category button to focus, we were just getting the row because we only cared about the rows. But since we're doing horizontal movement, we care about the columns. So we want to use the current selection in row instead. And before, where the categories were all buttons, that is not exactly the case for the store items. They are store item icons. So they have our button, they have our border, and they have all of our information inside of it, like the name and the description and the image. So we don't want to cast to a button anymore like we were before, but instead we now want to cast to the store item icon. So you can see they're very similar functions. Conceptually, they're like exactly the same, but we do have to change the variables we're using and the values we're using. So one more time, let's go into our determine item button to focus. This is the new function we're making for our horizontal movement over the store items. We want to use our item horizontal box. Then we want to get all children of that. And we want to get the current selection in row. Current selection in row is an integer that has a default value of 0 that we set up in a previous episode, and we change the value of in move selection. So if we're moving up and down, I was just resetting it to 0, so it was always on the leftmost. But if we're moving left and right, then you see that it actually depends on where we're at already and what input the player pressed. Essentially, current selection in row is this. Let's go into the store. The mannequin is a current selection in row of 0. The mutant is a current selection in row of 1. As far as the stages, this one's 0, this one's 1, this one's 2, this one's 3. So we use current selection in row, and we want to get the value, or basically the child, at that index. Instead of casting it to a button, we want to cast it to our store item icon widget. To do that, you can just drag off your get node here and cast to store item icon. Now, one other thing about this function, in our determine category button to focus, we had an output parameter that was of type button that I called button reference. But in our determine item button to focus, since we're not returning a button, we need to make sure that we're returning the appropriate type, which is a store item icon. So you can actually just search in here and make sure you get an object reference of the store item icon. And I've called that store item reference. Then I can pass the cast in on a success. If the cast fails, then I pass nothing in. We know that it's not valid. We didn't find a valid store item. Perfect. Now, in our move selection function, we want to make sure if we're going the horizontal path, the upper path, that we're calling our determine item button to focus, not determine category button to focus. So call your new function here. And off of this value, our store item reference that gets returned, we can grab the name and the description. That way we can set the name text and description text on our widget here. That way the player knows what they're hovering over if the icon alone is not enough. So taking the store item reference, you can literally type get name right here and get description right here. You'll get these two nodes. Now, since the name and description are just pieces of text, they're just text widgets, the way you set the text within them is to drag them into the graph. So name text, get, and description text, get. And then you drag off them again and type set text, and in parentheses it will say text. You want to do that for each of them, which is what we've done here. And for the in-text parameter, you want to pass in your strings. So for the name text, we're going to pass in the name variable. It will automatically convert it for you. If you just drag it in, it's going to say convert string to text, and you'll get this node. You can also just grab this node manually by dragging off of the name and typing to text in parentheses string. Basically, a string goes in, a piece of text comes out. We do that for the name and the description. So the name gets the name text, the description gets the description text. I do make sure that the store item reference is valid before doing anything with that. If it's not valid, I don't allow it to happen. Don't do anything, because if we found an invalid reference, we probably don't want to navigate to it. But that's just a safety check. If you want to do this, you can drag off your store item reference and just type is valid, and you want the one with the question mark. And only if it's valid do you bring it into your set text logic here. Move that over so it's a little cleaner. Now, after we've set the text for the widget, we want to go ahead and make sure that we display the hovered option. And what I mean by that is we want to display the border properly for the player. So remember, these icons technically have a black border around them by default. I know you can't really tell because the background is black, but they have that black border that we set up earlier in the episode. This thing. And we want to change that border to be this nice bright blue border, saying that we're selecting that option if the player has moved. So that's what we're trying to accomplish next. Now we already do that for the category as well. So let me close some of these tabs. Scroll up to my functions. We have a display hovered option function. And this function goes through and it checks to make sure that the button reference is valid. And if it is valid, we go through our category vertical box, get all the children, and check to see if the one that we are currently selecting matches the one in the loop. Basically, we loop through all the children, and if we're not on this button right now, we reset it to the standard button style. Otherwise, we set it to the selected button style, so the one with the blue outline. We essentially want to do the same thing for the store items. And so I went ahead and duplicated my function again. Right click, duplicate on display hovered option, or copy everything and paste it into a new function that you make. So I called my new function display hovered item option. For the same reason as before, I'm going to rename my original function, display hovered option, to be display hovered category option. And now we will know that the hovered category option is the one that is selected. Let's now go to our display hovered item option. You can see it looks very similar. It is a little bit different. I'm going to make a few changes here. So I do want to check for validity still. That is what we do in the display hovered category option. It's not really required here because we do check for it in move selection first so that we don't set the name and description text incorrect. So if you'd like, you could go ahead and remove this first is valid, as it is genuinely not needed. I'm going to do that just so it's a little bit faster. It doesn't have to do that one check. And now going to the display hovered category option, remember we were using the category vertical box, but that's not what we're doing here. When we're looping through our items, we want to use our item horizontal box. The vertical box holds all the horizontal boxes, but the horizontal boxes are what hold the items. So instead of using category vertical box, when we're talking about our items, we use our item horizontal box. We get all children and we loop through that. Now, in the category option one, we were casting the button, again, because all the category options are buttons. But we don't want to do that when we're looking at our store items, because instead we can cast the store item icon. So change your container, change your cast. And now, when we are in our category options, we were checking the result from the cast and making sure that it was not equal to the button reference that was passed in. You may not be able to do that because the cast here is a store item icon, not a button type. So just like before, we have to change the parameter of display hovered item option from button, okay, before it was button, called button reference. Now it is store item icon, object reference, again, store item icon, object reference, and the name is store item reference. Once you make that change, compile, then you should be able to drag off the store item icon and drag it into the not equal object node, which is this one right here, just like we had in the category function. And so the button reference that was being brought into that node as well is now going to be changed to the store item reference being brought into that node. Basically, we're saying if this is not equal to the item that we're on, we want to reset it back to the standard image. So in the category, we had brought the not equal node into a branch, and if it was true, we reset the button image to be the standard button appearance. In our case, for the item, the individual items, we do want to do basically the same thing, but it's a little bit different. Right now, what we're trying to do is actually set the style for the border and make sure that it is the right image. So instead of being that black border, it's going to be our blue one. So slightly different. In the category, we were using the button and calling set button style or set widget style. But now we're actually going to drag off the store item icon and grab our icon border variable. The icon border variable is the one we made earlier. It's that black border. So we grab that variable, and off that image, since it's not a button, it's just an image, we can call set brush right on it, which will allow us to change the image. So again, this if statement is checking to see that this is not the one we are currently selecting. If it is not, then we want to use our standard border. Remember, standard border is my black border image. So dragging off of icon border, if you type set brush, you will get this node by default. You can then right click on the in brush and split the struct pin to get a little bit more advanced node. At this point, I didn't bother messing with these image sizes or anything. It's not required because the actual image on the store item icon is already accurate. But the one thing we do want to change is the actual in-brush image here. So if we're not selecting this item, we want to use our standard border. Simple enough. But if this branch returns false, that means that the item we're highlighting is the item we're on in the loop. Basically, this is the item we've selected. So now we want to drag off of our item icon border, and we want to call set brush again, but we're going to use our P1 current selection image. And just so you can see it, that is my blue border here. This is just personal preference, but one thing I want to bring up, when we're on the character select, I do have this like blinking character select icon. In the store, we have this static icon. If you don't want that, you can use your blinking one as well. The materials will work the same way they do as the images do. So you can go to your set brush and use your material that you had. For me, it is M_P1 character selection border. And it looks like this. And that's this right here. So if you want, you can use that as well. I compile and save this and launch this. You'll see that when I'm in the store, I get that material. That's up to you. It depends on the effect that you want. But I just want to point that out. Now that we have this function working, let's go back to move selection. And we can make sure that we call it passing in these proper store item reference. So essentially, I did it after I set my name and description text, but you don't have to do it there. Just make sure that you call determine item button to focus and pass in your store item reference. So you see I have a reroute node. I call my new function display hovered item option, and I pass in that store item reference. Then the two paths, the horizontal and the vertical, join, and we go into the branch to determine if we should play a sound effect, and then if we should, we play the sound effect. So that's the same as it was. At this point, we're almost done. We need to do one more main thing, and that is to go into our change category function. Change category is where we click on the category, so we actually confirm that option. Then we bring up the different selections. So when we're on characters, we have characters shown, but when we actually select stages, then stages pop up in that horizontal box. Everything in here is pretty much exactly the same. But one thing that we do want to do is make sure that we are always passing along our name and description when we change categories. We did do this in the event graph, remember, right here. But change category also does this logic because we have to grab the appropriate type every time we change the category. So make sure in all these sections where set item details is being called, instead of just passing in the item image, the description and the name are also being passed in. So here's character, stage, outfit, and game settings. Now, additionally, once that's done, I bring all of them into one node. There was not here before. This is the move selection node. Again, I am just calling move selection with the horizontal movement. If we don't do this, say I leave it disconnected, I go into my store. Works the first time. When I go to my other categories, then there is no highlight. So the first time I press right, I end up on the second item in the store on that category. So by forcing a move selection call, it just puts that border there for us, which is a nice little touch. However, I will say I'm actually doing this slightly incorrectly. While this is okay to do, we actually should only do it when the loop completes, not on every loop iteration. It'll be a little slower that way. So I'd recommend we actually drag off of the for each loop completed right here and call move selection. Once you do that, then you can easily just add some reroute nodes or set it up however you want to clean it up. What I like to do is this. I just drag my line over there to a reroute node. And then I add another reroute node to just kind of group it up. So it's a pretty nice look. So there you go. Once the loop is completed, then all of these go to the move selection node. As simple as that. Now there is one final thing I'd like to do. It's super simple. If we go into our confirm selection function, I moved everything over just a little bit so that I could add a sound effect, and that is our standard confirm sound effect. I actually never did that for this widget, so there's no sound when you press confirm, which all of our other widgets do, so I figured we should do it here as well. And that is simple. You just add a play sound 2D function and then select your sound effect, which for me is confirm 2. Alright guys, and that's all I got for you today, so thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do. I just really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters. So grateful for you guys. Thank you for showing extra support for the series and everything that you do. I'm so grateful. Thank you so much. If you had any issues with this episode or any of my episodes, feel free to join the Discord community. There is a link in the description. It is completely free, and I'll be happy to help you. But otherwise, guys, like I said, that's all I got. So thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.